Welcome to the UO Today podcast, conversations that offer a glimpse into the heart of the humanities at the University of Oregon. Listen as our faculty, students, and guests introduce ideas and research that help us reflect on the past, navigate the present, and imagine possible futures. I'm Leah Middlebrook, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Fernando Gorab Leme, Assistant Professor of Classics at the University of Oregon. Professor Gorab Leme's research focuses on Greek and Latin lyric poetry, genre, performance studies, gender, epidectic rhetoric, and reception studies. He earned his PhD in classical studies at the University of Michigan in 2024, and he joined the UO faculty in the fall of 2025. Professor Gorab Leme, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I thought we might start just by asking a little bit about your background. What's your training? What are your interests?
Yeah, so my training is, I would say, very atypical. I'm from Brazil, and so I studied there through undergrad, and we have a very different approach to classical studies. It's very much our discipline in Brazil is very much within literary studies type of approach. I would say here in the US, we see it more connected to ancient civilizations. So my background is strongly literary. Um, and I was always like a literature nerd type of thing. Those are my initial interests. Um, and so that's how I kind of like got into classics. I was very lucky about the faculty I had in Brazil. So it really was through kind of like different people that were very invested in antiquity, in my education and the things that I was into. So that's how I got in the field. And so I studied classics and Portuguese when I was in Brazil. By the end of my undergrad, which is a little bit longer there than here, so it was a 5-year ordeal. And already within, we don't do majors and minors, so it was from the get-go kind of like ancient literature. So I knew by the end of it that I was interested in kind of like research, academia. And so from there, I ended up spending a year in England at the University of Durham, where I did a master's. And then from there, I moved to Michigan, where I did my PhD. So I have a little bit of a broad view of the field from different institutional perspectives, let's say.
What drew you specifically to classics? What drew you to the past?
I would say, even though I don't study it, it was Greek tragedy. I remember, I went into undergrad and I had a strong background in Brazilian literature, and that was what kind of like drew me in. But I remember on my first year, we had this class that was like Introduction to Classical Studies. And I remember just reading the Oresteia by Aeschylus, so the whole trilogy, and being like, wait, this is awesome. And so that's what ended up getting me into it. Um, and I would say, I think this idea I bring a little bit in my, as you already brought up in terms of my research of reception studies. I think we view ourselves maybe from being a romance language and all of that, our literary culture in Brazil. I think we perceive ourselves a little bit more in communication with antiquity when it comes to the literary works that we are producing in Brazil. So I think that kind of like those two things came together. I was like, oh, this is what I'm into. I did a year of English actually at first because I was a bit afraid of, what if, what if there's no jobs in classics, which is a real issue. But I was like, no, this is what I actually, love. So I ended up giving up on the English and moved down the hall to classical studies.
Wonderful. Thank you. Tell us a little bit about your dissertation.
Yes. So my dissertation, I'm doing a literary history of the wedding song, so it's a subgenre within lyrical poetry. My initial endeavor into it was a discussion I was having with a professor. I was like, "Oh, do we have any strong sense between that distinction of religious ritual versus a literary depiction of the ritual, right? Is this something that we have kind of like way of knowing, of accessing it?" And she kind of like as a throwaway comment said, "Oh, you should take a look into wedding poetry because, we have evidence for marriage, for dowry, from different, sources. But when you look specifically at the wedding ceremony, all the evidence we have is literary. So it's a very interesting question. And so I went along and looked at the two obvious sources, Sappho for the Greeks, Catullus for the Romans. And from the beginning, it was really striking to me. Sappho, we have, very fragmentary, probably, I want to say like 13 fragments of wedding poetry. Total maybe 20, 25 verses. How do you make up what a wedding ceremony looked like based out of such a small, corpus? And then reading Catullus, super engaged with Sappho, recreating, images, diction, meters, and just kind of like, wait a minute, is the wedding ceremony so kind of like stable throughout Greece and Rome that it just makes sense that he's using Sappho as a model? Is this a couple that for some reason within that kind of like aristocratic Roman late Republican setting is interested in marrying within a Greek style, and that's why we have that? Or is this, let's say, something 100% literary creation, right? Catullus is more interested with receptions of Sappho, engaging with this type of literature than necessarily presenting documental evidence, right? And that drew me in from the beginning. I was like, okay, we have kind of like a big question here. Um, Once I started putting my sources together, I ended up getting an even more interesting picture because it's very rare and serendipitous that for the wedding song specifically, we have examples throughout antiquity. This is something that we usually don't have, right? So you have Greek tragedy, kind of like 5th century Athens. Then we have a few fragments of Republican tragedy in Rome. Then our other main example of tragedy is going to be Seneca, Roman Empire, right? So we have these two very different moments where we have tragedy. Epic, we have with Homer, kind of like beginnings of epic, Homer, Hesiod. Then it skips down to Hellenistic Greece. Then it skips down to kind of like Roman Empire, right? So we have these moments where we have this literature. For the wedding song, by chance, I have examples, spread around in antiquity from archaic Greece down to the end of the empire. They are not super long, the poems, so I was able to take a look, put them together. Um, and they are literature, let's say, by women in significant ways, for women. So I realized that I would be able to put together a lot of my different interests. So ancient receptions, this connection between genre, and gender, and really trying to figure out, what are the characteristics of this literary production that are, let's say, intrinsic to it, and what are the things that are developing as we go from one generation to the other, right? So looking at this broader picture, and questioning this narrative that we have in scholarship that these songs that we have are primarily there as documental evidence for what a wedding ceremony looked like. So that's kind of like how I ended up getting into my dissertation that is now my monograph in progress.
Do you have a working title for your monograph, or are you still sort of thinking about that?
So I am thinking about it. My idea would be something along the lines of um before the bedroom, the genealogy and the women of Greek and Roman wedding song, because the idea is these songs happen before the couple is brought into the bedroom, um, and the songs would have been performed, let's say, at the threshold, right, in front of the bedroom of the couple. So there's that. The very name of the genre, epithalamion, is in front of the bedroom. And there are reasons for this in terms of the wedding ritual, right? Um, it's going to be different depending on the context that we're looking at from couple to couple. But generally speaking, we have a much younger girl getting married to an older man. Um, Again, changes from context to context, but generally speaking, they don't really know each other. So marriage really is kind of like their first introduction. And I read the sources looking a lot at the emotional charge that they have. And they are very interested in separation, female separation, right? So this girl who's going to
Hmm.
be taken away from her family, placed into this family of strangers in a lot of ways. She's going to have to experience the loss of her virginity, which is something completely unknown to her. And she will have to raise her family under her mother-in-law rather than her own NATO family, right? So this idea of NATO alienation and all of that um, is very strong in this production. Female anxieties about being taken away from their primary group of friends and of family. And so the ancients already question why these songs are done in front of the bedroom. Um, and so it shows a little bit kind of like the double-edged sword type of nature of this production, where yes, it is about celebration. Yes, it is about, you know, presenting the bride to the groom in the best possible light, telling them this is how blessed you are for being together, explaining to the girl, look, you're going to go through all of these difficult transitions, but this is why it's important. So ideas of marital happiness, success within the ancient context. But there's also this idea of violence, right? Where so the ancients will say things like, "Oh, these songs have to be very loud, so the people who are on the outside are not able to hear the girl inside who is screaming." You have this group of people in front of the door, and they function like the doorman, right? So they don't allow the girl if she wants to run away from her husband she can't, right? So she's locked inside of the bedroom. So I thought that this idea of before the bedroom brings a little bit this angle to it of both the celebration, but also the weight, um, because it would have been the most significant um, transition to happen in your life as a woman in antiquity.
This is all so, so interesting. Yeah, it just sounds like wonderful material to be bringing, into view. Do we know, did people of all ages sing these songs? I'm assuming it was a choral performance, right? It was a group of
Yes.
people. And then were they of all different ages, or did it tend to be older women, or do we know?
So that's hard to say. We don't know exactly how these choruses look like. Also, when we are going into that's something that I also get into my discussion because we have this production of Sappho that is clearly choral, very much targeting the young girl. And the idea that we have in terms of scholarship is that these songs have an educational purpose, both for the bride as she's experiencing this transition, but for the chorus. In a sense, by rehearsing these songs, performing at your friends' weddings, you are also learning what's going to happen to you later on in your life.
That's exactly what I was wondering. Yeah, yeah.
When we look at the later sources, so these are coming from male authors, they are very interested in this idea of choral performance of women. So even when I look at my later sources that are very narrative, so one of the big shifts that I notice in the wedding song is that they become increasingly more narrative. So they start including myths and things like that. You still have this kind of like memory of a chorus, of loud performances, of celebration, of musical instruments. So I believe that this sense of choral performance, even if just, let's say, make believe within the poem, is one of those characteristics of the genre, right? Um, but who exactly is performing? We don't know. They usually speak of choruses of young girls. We also have notices of choruses of young boys. Um,
Hmm,
in some settings, we have the
hmm.
impression that there are two choruses, one of boys, one of girls. So it's hard for us to get a coherent picture. We don't have a lot of information in that direction. We definitely know that younger and older women had um, possibilities of coming together in performance. This is something that shows up as early as Sappho. We have notice of fragments that describe married women and unmarried women in religious rituals, which is quite interesting. Um, the wedding is a family affair. It is because of that public and private. So portions of the wedding happen within the house of the bride, parts of the wedding ceremony happen within the house of the groom, and the most visual portion of the ceremony is a public procession from the house of the bride to the house of the groom. All of these events would have had
This
performance. And
is
so
so interesting. I
there's, yeah,
Go ahead, go ahead.
oh yeah, no, so there's this element of the public parading of this young woman who's, completely veiled. And based on the literary references we have, other women from the community are either, on the sides watching. So my imagination of it, at least, would have been that people are able to join, right? So these songs are highly traditional. You are the mother of the bride. Um, I think it makes sense that you would have been one of the people who are kind of like cheering on this chorus, maybe not right there with them, but around it. But the sources are kind of shaky in that direction, unfortunately.
We eagerly await this book. I think it's going to be a great contribution. I know you're interested in rhetoric as well. Can you tell us about how you work on rhetoric?
Yeah, so my interest in rhetoric is a little bit joins. So I use a lot of rhetoric to understand poetry. I would say I'm much more into poetry than prose. But the rhetoricians talk to us about several elements that are shared, right? So I did a lot of work in this, especially for my master's with visuality. And so the ancients talk a lot about how do you create a text that has vividness, that is able to create visual images. And this is something that shows up a lot in the wedding songs. They are even within their images, kind of like in smaller elements, like the similes, the metaphors. This element of vividness is present. This idea, as I said, the later authors utilize vividness to try to create the impression that you are, let's say, participating in a wedding procession. So I utilize a lot the conception of vividness. The ancient rhetoricians are very interested in emotions, and they theorize about the emotions. So I've done some work on shame, for example. And so I read, as I said, I don't believe that these songs are wedding poems or I think you can even make broader generalizations about these kind of like ritual or ritual looking songs. I don't think we should take them at face value as, let's say, documental evidence. Not that these elements aren't there, we don't have to question every single element. But I do believe that they are very attuned to this idea of the emotional landscape of the participants of the wedding. So this comes out a lot in the rhetoricians. And it is the rhetoricians who are the most interested, and we see this already, going back to Aristotle, where they are trying to categorize literature through this perception of a literary genre. So they
Hmm.
do this for poetry, they do this for prose. So kind of like a little bit of this ancient aesthetic judgment, right? So I appreciate the possibility that we have to read ancient texts also through the perspectives that the ancients had.
That is great. And it's sort of a segue to my next question. Can you tell us a little bit about the classes that you teach? How do you bring these interests into the classroom?
Yes, definitely. So, we teach here a lot of the language classes. So I would say this shows up at a very granular level, right? If you're taking the languages, we're able to go a little bit kind of like word for word, and look at these different dynamics. So, for example, I'm doing Aeneid in my intermediate Latin class, and we're doing book two, which is the Fall of Troy, and it is all about emotions. It is all about visuality. So you really get to see the fall of Troy, let's say, through your mind's eyes, using the ancient description of it. I'm also teaching, which I'm very excited about, gender and sexuality in antiquity. So I get to talk a lot about the wedding, but not only the wedding. I really try to do a broader view of men and women in antiquity and how the ancients conceptualize ideas of normativity and non-normativity because they do have different categories than we do. Um, but also tying up to ideas of classical reception. Um, in what ways is our modern understanding of gender and sexuality based on ancient models, right? And you can really make direct lines if you take figures like Freud, for example, and you
Hmm.
see how he's utilizing this very specific telling of the Oedipus myth in the play of Sophocles, and utilizes that as the model to understand how your infant sexuality works, and viewing the play kind of like as a little bit of the work of the psychologist, right? Where Oedipus is at the same time the source of his issues and the investigator of his issues, right? Going through this, and Freud, very much interested in antiquity, right? The metaphors he uses for the psychoanalytic process being an archaeology of your soul, right? So we have in that more quote unquote what becomes seen as the more normative approach to sexuality goes through antiquity. Non-normative approaches to sexuality as well, right? So you have these groups in London of the so-called Uranians that organize themselves in terms of what we would call kind of like LGBTQ activism from the gay perspective, utilizing Plato as a model. Or groups like the Sapphics in Paris, kind of like also late 19th century, people like Isadora Duncan, Sarah Bernhardt, and Natalie Barney, who are these groups of women who are reading Sappho together and taking advantage of the fragmentary nature of that corpus to try to create meaning and turn them into something productive for them, which ends up becoming the lesbian identity, right? For the ancients, Sappho wasn't a lesbian, or she was a lesbian to the extent that she came from the island of Lesbos. But for us, it makes all the sense, right, that we understand Sappho from that perspective, right, and reading her through the lenses of, let's say, queer affection. Um, so these are some places where it shows up, but I feel very lucky here in the classics department because we do have kind of like a broad range of classes where we are able to bring these things together. We teach, myth, mythology. A lot of these themes pop up in our mythology courses, Greece and Rome. So kind of like looking at this relationship between literature, society, history with, let's say, capital H history and the more social aspects of history that also shows up. Sports in antiquity. So yeah, it's a little bit a little bit of all these topics kind of like come together in the classroom.
That is just great. And I love how you sort of anticipated another question I was going to ask you, and you sort of began to frame an answer, which is, why should students in 2026 be studying classics? But I think you're starting to give us a sense of the richness.
Yes, it is, and I would say it is rich. There are several layers to it, and one of the reasons why I'm so interested in classical reception, it really comes out of this idea that um, antiquity persists beyond whatever arbitrary dates we give to the end of antiquity, whatever, the end of the Roman Empire and whatnot. You really realize that antiquity remains this center of intellectual curiosity. And that a lot of our modern debates, even though we lose track of it, are being formed by people and through people that are very engaged with antiquity, right? So I would say for the student, you have this multiple ways of approaching it, right? You're able to see it in a more detached way and try to say, okay, what is happening in antiquity? And it's interesting, almost as if studying kind of like from an anthropological lenses, right? So, oh, a different society, and how do I look at it? How do I approach it? How are they? We're lucky that we have a lot of information about the ancients in relation to other societies, right? So we were able to do it that way. But you are also able to consider it from the perspective of these structures of influence and the formation of a tradition, right? So something that comes out in the sports class that I don't think it's obvious at all is that no other cultures have a sports obsession like the Greeks and Romans do, and like we do. It's not like you have this ongoing tradition where people are into sports, and they were always into sports, and you go across the globe and people are in, you know what I mean? It's not a part of who we are. It doesn't seem to be a part of who we are. But for their specific reasons, the ancients build this structure of competitions. They build these structures of entertainment. These things essentially get lost through times, right? So it's not like you have Olympics during the Renaissance or medieval times or whatever. But then when we get to the end of the 19th century, people are reading Plato and Aristotle and they say, oh, wait a minute. There's a lot of value to having a sports education attached to an academic education, right? So the reason why we have intercollegiate sports today and why people are able to go to the stadium and watch like a Ducks game is because someone 100 years ago was reading Plato and Aristotle, right? And realized that it was a good idea. The reason why we have the Olympics today, our Olympics are not the ancient Olympics, right? And there were several other types of games that people were trying to create at that same kind of like moment of new Delphic games, Pythian games, Olympic games. the Olympic Games just happen to thrive and become popular through their very specific attempt to recreate antiquity, right? So, what I really appreciate, and I think that the students also appreciate, is that you're always able to question, right? Where are things coming from? How are we getting to where we are? So it really makes you think more about that very difficult relationship, right, between the object and the context, right? So I think classics really gives us that background to even if you're not going to do, let's say, become a professor of classics, I think it just opens a lot of avenues in those kind of like directions, and that's a little bit why classics are such a central part of a humanistic education, a liberal art education. And I think the students um, notice that when they come into the classroom.
I agree with you. I think so too. I have a course I teach on Ovid, and it's always interesting to me how much the students find themselves in their lives sort of
Yes,
refracted in that poem.
right. It's kind of like this place of this has nothing to do with me. Oh, actually, this has everything to do with me, and this kind of like at times uncomfortable place, right? Where you find yourself reading that and you say, okay, but why is it this way, right? And I like that you bring out Ovid, right? He is particularly provocative in that sense, right? Makes you really question your role as a reader in that sense, right? So as you're reading, you're like, I want nothing to do with this. But then a few lines later, you're like, wait, it sounds like he's speaking about me, right? This is this is to me, even though we're separated by 2,000 years of history. So yeah, that's one of the things that I enjoy the most about, studying classics and teaching classics, because I think once you find yourself reading the texts, you really start to kind of like question other things that you read and the way that you are taught, to read, to interpret, to engage. So yeah, that's one of my favorite, let's say, parts of what I do.
What attracted you to the University of Oregon? We're glad you're here. We're just wondering, what are some things you've discovered or noticed?
So I would say it really was the classics department. I can't kind of like speak highly enough. I think um, um, the job was listed, and I was like, oh, I know, just going through the department, like, oh, I actually know a lot of these people, use their work in my research. Um, and then coming here for the campus visit and whatnot. I was like, they are either very good at giving a good kind of like, presenting themselves in a very positive light, or they seem to be very kind of like a cohesive group, very friendly, and that really was what kind of like attracted to me. I felt very kind of like happy in seeing that it was not an act, right? We're a small department. We have to do a lot of work in terms of like punching a bit above our weight because we are a small department teaching kind of like a lot of big classes. So it is very collaborative. People are super helpful, super friendly. So that was kind of like my first, impression. But I've been really enjoying. Eugene is a lovely city. Campus is beautiful. The weather is nice. I'm I'm used to kind of like the Michigan winters, so being able to kind of like walk around not covered in, layer upon layer on layer during the winters, like it feels very nice. So yeah, it was a very kind of like welcomed change for me. I've really been enjoying my time here at UO.
Well, we are delighted to have you, and I'm so glad that we've had the opportunity to talk a little bit today. Thank you for making time.
Oh, me as well. Thanks for having me.
I've been speaking with Fernando Gorab Leme, Assistant Professor of Classics at the University of Oregon. Our research notes segment helps us keep current on recent developments in University of Oregon faculty and student humanities research, such as the book we will be discussing today, Burdens of Belonging: Race in an Unequal Nation by Jessica Vasquez-Tokos, published by New York University Press in 2025. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you.
Jessica Vasquez-Tokos is a professor of sociology and indigenous race and ethnic studies at the University of Oregon. Jessica, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for the invite. I'm glad to be here.
Tell us a bit about your research focus.
Sure. I'm a scholar of race, ethnicity, social inequalities, families, Latinos in the United States, migration, and intersectionality, which looks at overlapping and intersecting inequalities. I've looked at family formation, how race and ethnicity and understandings of that has shifted over time and over generations, how race matters in lifetime partnerships, both as a kind of so-called motivation for partnering within or outside of one's own racial and ethnic group, as well, or inside or outside, as well as consequences of those choices in terms of culture and understanding of race and ethnicity. I've also done work on Latino sociology, specifically Latino families and the Latino middle class. And then thinking also about the importance of kind of the strong hand of the racial state. That's a term by Omi and Winant. Omi being one of my mentors in graduate school. So thinking about how the racial state shapes families, as in makes them possible or impossible via policies and practices of, in this case, the United States. And so in total, really, I'm interested in thinking through and understanding and shedding light on the operation and the salience of race in social life, thinking about how race and ethnicity influences life experiences, yes, outcomes, and also day-to-day lived experiences that affects minds, bodies, and futures.
Really interesting. Tell us a bit about Burdens of Belonging: Race in an Unequal Nation.
Sure. A book that I really appreciated when I encountered it earlier on, and still continue to appreciate, of course, is W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, that was written originally in 1903. And he writes in there one line that has been often quoted and is really worth kind of chewing on. So he, as an African American scholar at the turn of the 20th century, was thinking about how the other, meaning the white world, was looking at him as an African American, and he was self-reflecting, like, how does it feel to be a problem, right, in the eyes of the dominant white mainstream power structure of the United States? And he felt that was being asked of him as an African American. Um, and what I was interested in doing with this book was really playing with that and taking that over 100 years later, right? I did the work in interviews in 2018, 2019, and just a couple in 2021. And I wanted to take an empirical look. So if I asked that of people who lived in Oregon, of varying racial and ethnic groups, so yes, African Americans, but going beyond the black-white divide, but also non-Hispanic white folks, indigenous folks, so there I'm lumping together Native Americans and Pacific Islanders, Asian Americans, and I also have some mixed race folks and those who are of Middle Eastern background. So if I ask that question empirically, how does it feel to be a quote unquote problem? How are people going to respond? So in essence, how does people's own sense of racial status in the United States inflect their sense of belonging? Right? So does it matter? Does it not matter? How does it matter? How does it matter? According to kind of what became apparent was a pretty strict, white slash non-white divide, but also there's a lot of different racial and ethnic categories within the non-white or the people of color category. And so thinking relationally about the different ways in which the people of color groups felt castigated, constricted based on race, and how that really affected their sense of belonging. So I was really in this project that was kind of a zooming Du Bois forward over 100 years later and trying to empirically assess the relevance of that question of how does it feel to be a problem in the United States, and thinking about the force of racial and ethnic background and across racial groups. I did interviews with 70 people located in Oregon, again, varied by racial status, and every single one of them was like, well, you pretty much need to be white in order to feel like you 100% belong without question in the United States. So then it's how people qualify their belonging or offer counter narratives and offer work in terms of how they belong, or offer kind of advice on how the United States could help them better belong, and advice on how the United States should run based on their subjugated knowledge, which is something I took really seriously going into the project. So I've been really invested throughout my career, and in this project included, in kind of unearthing and learning from what scholars, both Michel Foucault and Patricia Collins, call subjugated knowledge. So knowledge that's been kind of buried, because that knowledge comes from non-dominant groups. So I really engaged this project in hope of unearthing that subjugated knowledge and having the project be a knowledge project where the lived experience of marginalized people is valued and is upheld as a source of knowledge, right? So kind of talking back, the book itself, hopefully being a counter narrative to kind of master narratives that in total kind of demean and marginalize groups of color in the United States.
Mm. I guess I have two questions. I mean, my first one is, can you tell us a little bit about your research process as you were putting this book together?
Yeah, I love talking to people. And so it's a blessing to be able to have followed that, to be able to be trained as an in-depth interviewer. So I'm a qualitative researcher. And just in terms of the process, I mean, to get the 70 um, people who were interviewed, I worked through some professional contacts. I kind of pounded the pavement and advertised with little flyers in public establishments. I got the flyer out on some listservs that, because I wanted to stratify by racial status, those voluntary organizations were geared toward different racial and ethnic categories and groups of people. So I got the word out that way. And then I did what's called snowball sampling. So I would ask interviewees for other people that might be interviewed and might be interested in being interviewed to do some advertising for me. So through all of those, I ended up gathering 70 folks. And, I feel in terms of the interview process, what's so neat um, about it. And I think this loops to, a later question that I don't want to forecast too much, Tor, but I think, you ask later about how can we learn more? I feel like there is a nugget in terms of what a blessing interviewing can be, because people really can unveil precious knowledge to you if you show yourself to be an honest and engaged and open listener. And so I feel like that is my charge as an interviewer, to, shed whatever preconceived notions. If I come in with bias unbeknownst to me, be willing to let that go and be taught by other people. So I feel like that is a real valuable insight, just in terms of kind of the human condition and how we learn and grow empathy for other groups and let them tell us rather than presume. Our education system tends to be very, white normative centric. And so we don't always get these knowledges from kind of the canon or, sanctioned avenues. So again, I think in some, I think it's a real privilege and challenge to be able to have narratives to work with that people allow you access to. And that again was one of the big goals of the book, to be able to offer that to a wider readership as well.
Mm-hmm. No, that's wonderful. Thank you for that so much. And then, yes, I was thinking about the offering it to a wider readership, and I was wondering, who is this book for? Does it have sort of a workbook approach, or is it sort of narratives put together?
Yeah, I'm hoping it gets picked up by classrooms and students and, peers, and I hope it gets widely read. I think it's, excuse me, probably oriented a bit more towards kind of an academic audience. I would love if it managed to cross over and have a wider readership. I luckily have had readers tell me that yes, it's academic and yes, it's theoretical, but it's also profoundly empirical, and the stories grip you and they usher you in. And so that was a big goal, is to have not just people's lives be humanized, which of course is a huge goal, but also their subject positions, their perspectives. And I'm hoping that the stories usher readers, that is, in to understand other folks' perspectives and problems that have been cast, upon them as, racialized groups, again, with the focus being largely people of color, though non-Hispanic whites were also interviewed, and they offered a really interesting counterpoint of being exempted from a lot of problems that were reported to me by people of color, right? So the privilege was really animated by being able to show, look, there's a lot of escaping these issues if you're a non-Hispanic white person, as opposed to being saddled with issues if you're a person of color. And again, there's variation there with respect to the type of racialization people experience, or their nativity that might be assumed correctly or incorrectly, and the messages that they receive as a result of that. So I'm hoping it's a wide readership, and I'm hoping that the stories, because our lives are made of stories, I hope that makes it really approachable to people. I did teach one chapter to an undergraduate class here at University of Oregon. And luckily students really took to it. And some of the key phrasings, it was on education, and it was on how not just any type of institution or any particular institution, but institutions generally that were reported to me by the respondents. They produce white comfort, right, for students who have a non-Hispanic white background. There's a lot of comfort that is played to and privileged, and that is known, and that has been studied and talked about in education literature, a little bit in psychology, not so much in sociology, so I was trying to shine a light there. But the antonym of white comfort hasn't actually had much discussed. And so the antonym for me was really important. So if there's white comfort, then the converse is non-white discomfort, right? Or discomfort experienced and confronted by students of color or people of color working in those institutions. And so again, like trying to usher in people with some of those stories, and some of them seem to really resound with the students in the classroom that I taught, because even weeks later, some of those key words and key concepts kept coming up as explaining students' experience, which, as an author and researcher, that is what you want to do. You want to help people understand their lived experience and help them understand that while they as individuals are unique and we all have agency and power and decision making, oftentimes our experiences are patterned and we do fit into trends. And so there can be a sense of relief of, oh, it wasn't just me or my failing, right? Or my particular situation. That's something bigger, which can be emboldening, can also be a little cowing, right? But to put that in perspective, I feel like is part of the goal of education and research. So
Tell us, what makes this topic important to humanity? I mean, you've been pointing to this, but
yeah.
that is one of the questions we like to ask in research notes.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I realize that it sort of has wedded itself through already, but to put a exclamation point on it, I guess I would just say that I think this book and my work in general really tries to humanize people, and this book in particular trying to lend a historical perspective to racial groups' kind of subject position or location in a racial hierarchy. Again, I'm a race scholar, so really thinking about the racial hierarchy. And one of the really important pieces here is that I dedicate an entire chapter to answer that question, right? So Du Bois's self-reflective question of what is it, how does it feel to be a problem, right? So I actually spent a whole chapter thinking historically about the state, so meaning the federal government and the moves of the United States government, how historically and now still the US government actively constructs groups of color as so-called problems, right? And so it's not that these groups quote unquote naturally emerge as problems. They're constructed as problems by the government. So we can take, a contemporary example of certainly ICE raids, border patrol, and detention of toddlers in blue bunny hats, right? These folks, youth, babies are constructed as groups of color, as problems in the United States. If we want to look more historically, we can think about land destruction practices and usurpation of land of native people, native territories. I have a respondent who grew up in Hawaii, and she was devastated by seeing her land on fire and just the land destruction there. What she was looking at was U.S. military practice happening on Hawaii, and the landscape that would be ravaged and aflame. And so she would just bawl, and she was tearing up. She told me this as her mother would take her and show her this when it would happen on a regular basis. And so then she was telling me about, well, my land is susceptible to being treated like this, and we, the people, are similarly subjected to harm, right? Like we don't matter as much, right? As people on the quote unquote mainland, right? Even that language is sidelining, right? Territories or island states. Another historical example is to thinking about how the United States government will engage in foreign wars, like in Vietnam and World War II and Japan. And so I had interviewees hailing from Vietnamese or Japanese descent, and they, if not their parents, were US born, and yet they really carried the burden of what I ended up calling being military racial opponents, meaning that their lands or their ancestral lands, they might not have even set foot in or lived in, but they, by virtue of being a descendant of a nation with which the US has gone to war, feel like they are a military combatant and vilified as a result. Right. So it's really the historical legacy of US military occupation that leads to the vilification of present day, in this case, Asian Americans. And they feel even generations later that they're, unwanted or they're seen as an enemy. I mean, certainly the internment of Japanese Americans, even if not experienced by my respondents, that was looked at with great concern. And one person just seized about it's the principle of the thing, right? It's the principle that my ancestors were, corralled up and seen by virtue of being having a phenotype like mine, that we were an enemy combatant and treated as such, within the bounds of the territory. And, this has particular resonance as the same person was telling me, well, I'm being stared at in the Costco, as I'm shopping. Is this a relic of that? Right? Even generations later. So again, the humanizing part is just trying to draw the threads, in this case, to think about the force of history and the force of powerful actors like the government and how that shapes how groups are valued in the United States, and then how people feel that value, and either kind of, are feel that value is bestowed upon them or challenge it and try to engage in revaluing themselves with the kind of collective efforts of family or community members to try to invest their group with more esteem that isn't based on the yardstick of a government that has held whiteness as a priority.
Right, which is can be joyous and affirming and meaningful activity, but it also is a burden, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
We wanted to just ask you as our final question, where can our listeners learn more about these topics? So everyone will go out and get your book,
There
but
you go. Yeah, hope so. That'd be great.
additional
Yes.
reading or adjacent reading?
Sure. So, I didn't come to this question with specific examples other than, yes, it'd be great if folks read my book, but I would just say largely kind of classes, books, and people, right? I mean, kind of like looping back to what I was forecasting before, right? So, as a tip from a researcher who specializes in interviews, right? People can entrust in you if you show yourself to be an honest, interested, engaged, willing to learn from different perspectives person. People can entrust you with incredible stories about their lives. So I would just urge people to be open to learning across boundaries, whichever boundaries they are. We've been talking here about racial categories and racial boundaries, but certainly we can talk about gender, nativity, legal status, sexual orientation, class status, education, religion. So be open to learning about people across boundaries, and allow for pathways to consciousness raising, right? Being changed, being shaken up, and being challenged. And then this could also potentially lead towards empathy, right? That was another current in the book, that the consciousness raising can lead toward empathy. And both of these, right, can serve social justice, including a deeper understanding of other people and more humane treatment, which is something I certainly hope we are going to be moving toward. But I think it takes some willing to listen and willing to kind of critically self-reflect, including one's own privilege and one's challenges or disadvantages as well, potentially, but then being open to learn from others and learn from their experience and understand that they're coming from a different subject position and they've been potentially treated differently, and it might be so different that it's hard to wrap one's heads around, but that doesn't make it untrue. It just is coming from a different perspective. So openness there, I would urge.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
Sure.
And congratulations again on just what sounds like a terrific book. I'm going to go pick it up this afternoon.
Oh, yay. Great. I'm glad to hear it. Well, thank you again for having me on. It's a treat.
Jessica Vasquez-Tokos is professor of sociology and indigenous race and ethnic studies at the University of Oregon. UO Today is a production of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Thanks for listening.